So, hello everyone. We are starting our second session of oncological emergencies, and as I can see, there are few of us, so make it a little interactive session so that uh, whatever doubts you have, they will be answered at the same point. So, my name is Ravi Jaiswal. I'm a medical oncologist. At present, I'm working in Raipur. So, in the last class, we have seen that the oncological emergencies are categorized into these five groups. The red ones are the ones which were discussed in the last class. In the metabolic, we have spoken about the tumor lysis syndrome, hypercalcemia, hyponatremia. In the neurological, we spoke about spinal cord compression and raised intracranial pressure. In the cardiovascular, we have pericardial effusion and SVC syndrome. SVC was discussed in the last class. In the hematological, we have hyperleukocytosis, hyperviscosity, and infections. We have neutropenic fever. So for today's class, what I have done is I have made a case scenario which is relevant to one particular emergency, and then based on the case scenario, we will be discussing the emergency. So this is our first case. This is a 50-year-old female who is diagnosed as carcinoma of left breast, locally advanced, and she started on neoadjuvant chemotherapy with AC regimen. On day 10, she presented to emergency with fever and hypotension. So, what is a differential diagnosis when someone on chemotherapy, particularly the highlight here they have mentioned is day 10, presents with fever and hypotension? So, as simple as that, this is a case of febrile neutropenia. So, two words are important here. One is febrile and other is neutropenia. Any fever which is more than 38.3 degrees Celsius, that is a single reading, or if it is for more than 1 hour, continuously 38 degrees Celsius. This is the definition of fever for the sake of febrile neutropenia, plus neutropenia, which is defined as absolute neutrophil count, which is less than 500 per millimeter cube. So remember here we are talking about absolute neutrophil count. So whenever we get a WBC count, out of that we calculate how many neutrophils are present. Along with that, how many band forms are present. So the MCQ question will be that ANC is absolute neutrophil count, neutrophil plus band form, neutrophil plus metamyelocyte, blah blah blah. So you should click on neutrophil plus band form. So neutrophil plus band forms, if it is less than 500, or it is expected to fall to this level on treatment. So both these things are important. One, your fever that is 38, and your ANC that is less than 500. So this is defined as a febrile neutropenia. So what are the factors which result in febrile neutropenia? So whenever there is breach of skin and mucosal barriers because of insertion of IV access, be that a central or a PICC line or a port, whenever there is mucositis, this is we commonly see, particularly after chemotherapy, there is, or a radiation therapy, there is breach in the mucosal barrier which results in mucositis, or because of surgery or a tumor growth. Secondly, the factors which are because of the disease or therapy, like CLL or multiple myeloma, where there is less globulins which fight against the infection, or in hematological malignancies like ALL, Hodgkin's, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, where there is defective cell-mediated immunity, where there is more chance of getting a pneumocystis or a cryptococcal infection, or when our patients are on steroids, then they have more chance of developing aspergillus, cryptococcal, mycobacterial infection, or chemotherapy like cytarabine, which are known to cause mucositis leading to streptococcal infection. So what should we do whenever we have this patient of febrile neutropenia? On initial evaluation, we would be taking a good history where we'll ask our patient that their time since last chemotherapy, what are the comorbid condition this patient is having, is there a travel history? This is relevant in COVID times. Second, if there is any history of prior documented infection, then on examination, we will see the IV access of the patient. Is there a central line or a PICC line or a chemoport? Is there any pus around the line? Is there any, the dressing is soiled? So we would look for a focus of infection. We would always look for oropharynx. So in the mouth, how is the teeth? How is the oral cavity? Is there a mucositis sitting there? We'll look at the nasal cavity. Is there any source of infection there? Then we'll look at the skin, particularly the moist areas like the vaginal area or the perineal area. And on investigation, we would order an X-ray, a routine CBC to look at the neutrophils. We would look at the electrolytes, particularly if patient has altered behavior, and we would send blood culture. So we usually send two sets of blood culture. There is a concept which is known as differential time to positivity. So whenever there is a central line inserted, so we send a culture from the central line as well as from the peripheral line, and we look at what is the difference in the time to positivity. If it is more than 120, for example, if your central line is growing earlier than your peripheral blood by more than 120 minutes, then we are sure that this is a central line associated infection. If both the lines are developing the same organism which is less than 120 minutes, then we are sure that it is a systemic infection and not the line which is infected. So this is known as differential time to positivity. Apart from that, we send the throat and the wound swab and urine and stool culture based on the symptoms of the patient. So whenever we have diagnosed a patient to have a febrile neutropenia, now we have to categorize this patient into a low risk or a high risk. So how do we classify? There are two societies. One is the IDSA, which gives the infection control guidelines, and their IDSA classification based on high risk and low risk is as follows. A patient who requires inpatient admission, who has comorbidity like hypotension, who has uncontrolled cancer, whose creatinine is more than 2, whose LFT is more than 3 times normal, who is a recipient of transplant, and who has severe neutropenia. This is categorized as high risk. But for the sake of examination, I would suggest you to remember this classification, which is known as the MSCC score. This will be asked to you that how will you categorize the patient. So here they have considered only 7 factors and the maximum score is 26. So if you get a score which is more than 21, you would be considered as low risk based on this classification. So what this classification includes? It includes your presence of symptoms. So if you have mild symptoms, if you don't have hypotension, if you don't have COPD, if there's no previous fungal infection, if there's no dehydration, you have an outpatient status, and your age is less than 60. So clubbing all this, you get a score of 26. And whenever it is more than 21, it will be categorized as low risk, and these patients can be treated for oral therapy. They don't require a systemic therapy. So this is, one second. So this is the MSCC score that you should be remembering. This will be asked in examination. So whenever you have a febrile neutropenia and now you have categorized them into either a low risk or a high risk. So low risk, you'd consider them for a home therapy. That is, the patient need not be admitted. And whenever we talk about home therapy, you will give them amoxicillin plus clavulanic acid along with a fluoroquinolone, that is a ciprofloxacin. So 5-day regimen. Secondly, when you categorize the patient as a high risk, then you have to decide whether the patient requires vancomycin or not. We will see which is the patient which requires vancomycin, and then you put this patient either on a vancomycin regimen or a standard 2-drug regimen. So the most commonly followed 2-drug regimen is a cephalosporin plus an aminoglycoside. So we use either a ceftazidime or a cefepime along with a aminoglycoside, that is amikacin. So usually you must be seeing that the patients are put on Magnex plus amikacin. So your Magnex is a cephalosporin and your amikacin is a aminoglycoside. So these are standard go-to regimen. Apart from that, whenever vancomycin is needed, then we add vancomycin along with this combination. So what are the indication for vancomycin? This is again an important question. So whenever we suspect patients to be having a gram-positive sepsis, like a catheter-related infection, or when there is a known colonization with a penicillin or a cephalosporin-resistant pneumococci or a MRSA. Third, whenever your blood culture is positive for a gram-positive bacteria. Fourth, whenever a patient has hypotension, remember, whenever a patient has hypotension, your manganese amic acid is not sufficient. You need to add an extra gram positive coverage in the form of vancomycin. This is from the IDSA guidelines. Now, this is already we have discussed. Whenever you have someone who's got a low risk of infection, you give them standard ciprofloxacin plus amoxiclav. And if patient is allergic to penicillin, you can substitute amoxiclav with a clindamycin. And whenever your patient requires an IV therapy, you put them on Magnex amikacin plus or minus vancomycin. If the patient is afebrile after 3 to 5 days, you would stop the drugs, you discharge the patient. If you can isolate an organism based on your blood culture, you'd change your therapy based on your blood culture report. But if your patient remains positive or he has a continuous fever which is lasting for more than 3 to 5 days on therapy, then what you should be doing, you should change your antibiotics if your culture is positive, or if your culture is negative and or if you are on the sensitive drugs, then you should consider adding antifungal therapy. Remember, antifungal therapy is not started on day 1. It is only after 3 to 5 days of antibacterial therapy. When your patient still continues to have a fever, only then will you add an antifungal agent. So again, the same thing. Whenever your patient has a fever, you give antibiotics 3 to 5 days. He is afebrile. You will stop, send home. If he continues to have fever, you change your antibiotics. You see the requirement of adding a fungal agent or adding an vancomycin. So this is what febrile neutropenia antibiotic guidelines are. The second question is when you should be adding a growth factor. So we know that we commonly use a granulocyte colony stimulating factor. So it is available either as a short acting or a long acting. The long acting ones are given as a prophylactic, but febrile neutropenia is an emergent condition. You want the short acting growth factor. So we use the normal filgrastim injection here. So studies across have shown that whenever you use a growth factor, this will shorten the duration of neutropenia. Whether this would lead to a survival advantage or a mortality benefit has not been proven till now, but your hospital admission duration would be definitely reduced based on a couple of studies which are published. So till now, we know that using granulocyte factors would shorten neutropenia, would shorten the hospital stay, but whether this would result in a mortality benefit has not been proven till now. But whenever you have a neutropenia, you will always use a colony stimulating factor along with your antibiotics. So this was our case 1 where we've discussed about febrile neutropenia. Now we'll go to case 2. Again, this is a very standard question you all will get in your exams. So this is a 64-year-old gentleman who is diagnosed to have a carcinoma of prostate. It is a CRPC on enzalutamide at present, and he presents to emergency with severe lower back pain, and he describes the pain as gradually increasing over 4 weeks. It is persistent, and now he is bed restricted. So what are we dealing with? So straightforward question. Anyone who's got a back pain, which is progressively increasing on the background of a malignancy, you should always think of this entity, which is known as a spinal cord compression. So as you can see in the picture, there is a cord and the circle shows where the cord, you're not able to see the cord there. There is a lesion there. So this a fracture resulting in compression of the spinal cord. So what is a spinal cord compression? A neoplastic epidural spinal cord compression, which is defined as thecal sac indentation which is seen on the scan. The most common location is in the thoracic spine, second in the lumbar, and very, very less commonly you will see in the cervical spine. So cord compression is a very, very common problem that we see in our day-to-day practice, particularly patients who have prostate, lung, and breast cancer. Patients usually present with a pain. Apart from that, they have a sensory or a motor loss. And then if this is neglected, this would result in a neuro deficit. So back pain is the most common manifestation which is seen in this patient. And the peculiarity of this back pain is that this pain would increase in supine position. So whenever there is a patient is in supine position, he would be having more pain. The other important thing here is that whenever the lesion is at a thoracic or a lumbar level, it is usually not life threatening. Only when it is in the cervical level, that is C1, C2, where your atlas and axis vertebra are there, it is at this level that patient will have paraplegia or could have a respiratory arrest. So only at this level, it will be life threatening. Apart from that, it won't be life threatening. So the most common is the vertebral metastasis, most commonly from a prostate cancer. The other causes are breast cancer, lung cancer, lymphoma, or a renal cell cancer. So how do you diagnose? So whenever you have a background of one of these malignancies and patient complains of back pain, high index of suspicion is required. You should not take this patient for granted. Your plain X-ray is not sufficient. You should always subject these patients for an MRI scan. So what is the peculiarity of this MRI? You should ask for a non-contrast MRI. So contrast MRI is not required. Non-contrast MRI is sufficient. And you should always ask for a whole spine screening. So if you suspect that the lesion is in the thoracic, you ask for a MRI of the thoracic spine with whole spine screening, so that you get the extent of the lesion is better appreciable. And you can see the entire spinal cord, the length of the entire spinal cord. So MRI is better because it is multiplanar, radiation is not required, contrast is not required, and multiple lesion can be detected. It has very high sensitivity and specificity. And also, if there is a lesion there, you can always get a guided biopsy based on your MRI. Okay, so now what you should do when you have a patient of malignant spinal cord compression? Your treatment is steroids, either radiation or surgery. So the most important thing is you should not wait for your definitive therapy. As soon as you diagnose, you should put this patient on steroids. So steroids are a magic drug here. And how do you choose between radiation and surgery? We would see in subsequent slide. So first about steroids, we know that steroids, they have anti-inflammatory action. They give pain relief whenever there is a edema sitting there around the nerve. This edema resolves rapidly, and the neurological structures, the pressure is released there, and the patient gets immediate relief from their symptoms. So usually a loading dose of 16 milligram followed by 8 milligram BD is standard practice. Studies have done which have used up till 100 milligram of steroids, but they have shown that 16 milligram is sufficient for the patient. Particularly high dose are tried in patients who have paraplegia at presentation. And whenever you get a significant relief, remember you should always taper your steroids quickly. In this slide, I have highlighted a few important points that you should understand. So first statement here is that whenever you have a cord compression plus a fracture, that is a mechanical instability. So you have a fracture or an unstable bony fragment. This patient should not be subjected to radiation. They should be subjected to surgery. So remember, malignant spinal cord compression plus mechanical instability, either in the form of a fracture or an unstable bony fragment, this patient would get a surgery and they would be decompressed and stabilized. On the contrary, if you have a cord compression with stable fragments and there is no mechanical instability, so all your vertebra are aligned, these patients are for radiation therapy. They should not be subjected to surgery. So whenever there is mechanical instability, you will send the patient for surgery. Whenever your spinal cord is stable, this patient would get radiation therapy. So again, Cord compression, no fracture, radiation therapy, particularly if you have a very, very chemosensitive disease like a lymphoma. These are the patients who would benefit from chemotherapy rather than surgery or radiation therapy. Again, you should start steroid immediately to reduce the edema, and bed rest is vital. Apart from that, what you would do, you'd give them adequate analgesia, you'd give them anticoagulation because paraplegia would set into DVT. You'd take care of their bowel function, and whenever possible, and the pain is not subsiding, you'd consider spinal bracing. So this is the algorithm of what we have discussed. For a case of malignant spinal cord compression, you do a very good examination. X-ray is not sufficient. You'd do an MRI for this patient. On the MRI, you'd see the level of obstruction. If there is mechanical instability, surgery. No mechanical instability, radiation, only lymphoma, you do chemotherapy, and this is how you'd manage this case. So now we move on to our third case of our today's discussion of oncological emergency. This is a 48-year-old female who is diagnosed to have an ALK positive non-small cell lung cancer, who started on crizotinib and who's presented in OPD with an altered sensorium. So lung cancer on therapy, altered sensorium, seizure. What is your thought? Again, very simple. We are talking about brain metastasis. So whenever patient who has a diagnosis of cancer presents with altered behavior, apart from all your causes of your electrolyte dysfunction and all that stuff, always remember about your brain metastasis. So brain metastasis is a very common problem that we see in these malignancies: lung cancer, breast cancer, particularly those who are HER2 positive, melanoma, leukemias, and lymphomas. So whenever you have one of these, possibly one of these cancers, you should always think about brain metastasis. And how do these patients present? They would present because of direct compressive effect of the tumor or because of the vasogenic edema. So how will you evaluate this patient? So first you would see their symptoms, whether they have headache, seizures, is there any focal neurological deficit in the form of weakness present. Then you'd walk up these patients, you do a examination, you'd get an MRI. We usually don't do a CT scan unless there is contraindication for MRI if patient is not cooperative and if you don't have an MRI available. But almost always you would get an MR done, because even the tiny lesion which could be missed on the CT would be picked up on your MRI, and your MRI has a better tissue contrast. So the first you do symptomatic treatment, and we know that whenever patient with brain metastasis come, we start them on dexa and mannitol. So what our dexamethasone does? So this dexamethasone would take care of your vasogenic edema surrounding the tumor. So all this, the neurological deficit the patient has initially, it is because of the edema which is surrounding the tumor. So this edema would be absorbed because of your dexamethasone, and we start with a standard 16 milligram bolus followed by 8 milligram BD dose. And mannitol also does the same thing. It would decrease the intracranial pressure and patient would be better of his neurological symptoms. The second controversial area is about use of anticonvulsant therapy. So remember, if your patient has seizures, he will get an anticonvulsant therapy. We prefer levetiracetam. We don't use phenytoin these days because of better tolerability and efficacy. If a patient does not have a seizure, then you will not administer routine prophylactic anticonvulsant to these patients. If you have a solitary brain metastasis, you can consider either for a surgery or a targeted radiation, which is known as a stereotactic radiation surgery, or a surgery. Both are valid and equally efficacious option for a tumor which is less than 3 centimeter. But if you have multiple lesions, then your surgery is ruled out. These are the patients for whole brain radiotherapy plus or minus boost to the lesion which is more than 3 centimeter. Again, if you have multiple brain metastases, they would go for a palliative radiation. The standard protocol is 30 grain 10 fraction, and there is no role of chemotherapy. There are very few drugs which penetrate your blood-brain barrier, and your only if your disease involves your meninges, then you would consider intrathecal chemotherapy. Otherwise, there is no role of chemotherapy for brain metastasis. So case number 4, and this is our last case for today's discussion. This is interesting and also important because we usually are not aware of, or we miss this whenever we consider this as a differential entity. So here is a 18-year-old young gentleman who is recently diagnosed to have an acute myeloid leukemia, and who presents with to emergency with a WBC count of 2,20,000, which has predominantly 90% blast. His presenting complaint is breathlessness. So what is the differential diagnosis of someone with a high count recently diagnosed AML? So we always think about infection first. So we think about infection, malignancy related, or tumor lysis syndrome. But what we fail to realize is that there is another entity which is known as hyperleukocytosis, which results in this presentation. So what is hyperleukocytosis? It is a clinico-pathological syndrome which is caused because of sludging of your blast. So these blasts will block your vessels. So as simple as that, your blast of this leukemia would be present in the microvasculature. So it would be present in your bronchial vessels, and they would stop the circulation at that point, and this would result in breathlessness. So what are the risk factors? The risk factors are younger age, acute leukemias, and certain cytogenetic abnormalities like Philadelphia chromosome or 11q23 translocation. Remember, the mortality rate is very high. It is 40% when someone presents with hyperleukocytosis. The symptoms are based on the site of location of the vasculature. For example, if your pulmonary vasculature is involved, then patient would have breathlessness. And this breathlessness would be manifested on the scan in the form of interstitial or alveolar infiltrate. And routinely, this patient would be labeled to have an ARDS. You would be thinking that the patient has ARDS, you would put them on antibiotics, antivirals, steroids. You would fail to realize that no, this is because of leukocytosis. And in ABG, you would see that there is hypoxemia. Whenever there is a blockage of your intracranial vessel, the patient would manifest as confusion and somnolence. Similarly, if your retinal vessels are involved or renal vessels are involved, you would get either a retinal vein thrombosis, myocardial infarction, renal vein thrombosis, priapism, or a DIC. So based on your vessel involved, you would have those symptoms. So what measures will you take? You'd hydrate this patient, their urine will be alkalinized, and you'd correct their thrombocytopenia and prevent the manifestation of DIC. Certain specific measures need to be taken, like leukapheresis. So what does leukapheresis means? It means you are removing the WBCs by an apheresis machine. So you would be seeing in the transplant units, there is an apheresis device. This apheresis would remove your blood products. So whenever you're removing the WBC, it is known as leukapheresis. So your single session would remove it by 20 to 50%, and it would also help you in administering other deficient blood products. The other thing you can do is leukocytoreduction, that is killing of your WBCs by a cytotoxic chemotherapy. So in AML or CML, we use a hydroxyurea. This would kill your myeloid lineage cells. Also, in ALL, you would use steroids or cyclophosphamide. They would act as a leukocytoreductive agents. The third thing, which is not routinely done, is a cranial radiation, which is still experimental and not commonly done. So this is how you manage a case of hyperleukocytosis. So index of suspicion is very important. Whenever you have someone who's presenting with leukemia, high counts, no diagnosis of infection, no documented infection, always remember there is a possibility of hyperleukocytosis. You would hydrate this patient, you'd give supportive care, and you take specific measure in the form of leukapheresis and leukocytoreduction. So that is all that we are going to discuss today in our oncological emergencies. So let's quickly revise our oncological emergencies. So let me go back to my first slide. So we have classified our oncological emergencies into metabolic, neurologic, cardiovascular, hematologic, and infection. In the first class, we have seen how our hemolysis syndrome and hypercalcemia is managed. Today, we have seen how to manage cord compression, where we've spoken about steroids, radiation, and surgery, in mechanical instability surgery. If there is no mechanical instability, radiation. Whenever raised intracranial pressure because of brain metastasis, we've spoken about dexamethasone and mannitol. In cardiovascular, in the last class, we've discussed SVC syndrome. Again, it was very there. If you're grade 4, then you'd stent the patient. If it is grade 1 to, you'd consider either a radiation therapy or a chemotherapy based on the chemosensitiveness of the disease. Third, today we've discussed about hyperleukocytosis. We've spoken about supportive care and specific measure like leukapheresis. And in the last, that is infective causes, always remember neutropenic fever. When a patient comes with a neutropenic fever, you'd categorize their MASCC score, you'd put them into a low risk and a high risk. Low risk, amoxiclav and ciprofloxacin; high risk, Magnex amikacin plus or minus vancomycin. And if patient continues to have fever, we've spoken about adding an antifungal agent. So I think this is all you should remember in your oncological emergencies. And if there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you, all of you, for listening.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a comprehensive presentation. If you have any questions, please use the chat box, or you can also unmute and ask. There are two questions in the chat box.
So this I can see in the chat box. Ananya has written, sir, how will you confirm the diagnosis of hyperleukocytosis using RT as a... Okay, so first question we will answer about hyperleukocytosis. So Ananya, let me go to the slide of hyperleukocytosis and let me tell you that the most important thing is suspicion. So whenever you have someone who's got WBC count which is in the range of more than 1 lakh, 2 lakh, and predominantly blasts are present, and patient is young, and there is no documented infection that the patient has, and this patient has symptoms which fall into one of these categories like a breathlessness or confusion, and where you cannot contribute this to a particular infective cause, then you think that the patient has hyperleukocytosis, and you'd subject this patient for leukocytoreduction either by an apheresis machine or by a chemotherapy drug which would kill this cell. So the most important thing is high index of suspicion and no documented infection. In one of these situations, you would consider the patient to have hyperleukocytosis. It is a clinical diagnosis, so there's nothing to confirm it. Your suspicion has to be very high. The second question is using RT as a definitive therapy for cord compression. Yes. So doesn't increase the risk of permanent neurological damage as the effect of radiation takes time to manifest. So studies have shown that whenever there is a mechanical instability, only then your surgery is going to be helpful. Apart from that, if there is no mechanical instability, there's no point of doing surgery. Your radiation is a good modality of treatment, and the time taken for radiation therapy to act is anywhere around 3 to 5 days. So after that time, the patient would be feeling better, and your steroids, you're giving a coverage initially to take care of the neurological compromise. So I don't think that it increases the risk of permanent neurological damage, because if you are not going to treat it, anyways your patient is going to land into neuro deficit. The another is, in a case of oncological emergencies, is biopsy mandatory to proceed with radiotherapy. So it depends on what you're talking about. For example, if you're talking about SVC syndrome, which is causing an oncological emergency, we would always subject the patient to certain biopsy to prove the type of cancer. Because if it is a chemosensitive tumor, then only your patient would go for a chemotherapy. Otherwise, you'd put them on radiotherapy. So whenever it is possible, you always get a biopsy done. If you already have a patient, for example, someone has a diagnosis of CA prostate, so you know that this gentleman has CA prostate, and now he's come with a malignant spinal cord compression. In that scenario, you don't need a biopsy. But if you don't have the diagnosis pre-existing cause as a cancer, then you definitely need a biopsy to start either a radiotherapy or a chemotherapy. Anything else?
Sir, in the case of spinal cord compression, you said that we can give steroids up to 100 mg per day. Like there
I
are
mean,
reports.
studies have done.
So,
They have used till 100 mg.
So what dose can we start with, and how to take if we give a high dose initially?
So give 16 milligrams. So across the board, everyone does 16 milligram loading dose and then 8 milligrams BD. So you give this for 5 days, and every 5 days you will taper. So first you will make 8 milligrams BD for 5 days, then you will make 4 milligram BD for 5 days, then you will make 4 milligram OD5 for 5 days, and then you will stop. So across all the boards, whenever you're using steroids, follow this mantra: 16 milligram loading dose, 8 milligram BD for 5 days, then 8 milligram OD for 5 days, then 4 milligram OD for 5 days.
Okay. And sir, in case of febrile neutropenia, should we give blood culture in every case? And
Yes, all cases.
like if we start all
No
cases.
antibiotics before sending blood culture.
And suppose if we if we didn't send blood culture initially, so can we abruptly shift from one antibiotic to another, or should we always complete the 3-day or 5-day course of a particular antibiotic that was started?
So the rule of thumb is that any antibiotic that you started, you should wait for at least 48 hours before you change to another antibiotic. But if your patient is deteriorating, for example, he's on inotropes, hypotensive, breathless, and then we have to act. You cannot wait for another 48 hours. So you directly jump to your meropenem or colistin or something like that. But then this is just a decision that you'd be taking, and there is no scientific evidence to suggest that this decision is going to benefit the patient. We all do that in practice, but the standard answer, textbook answer for that would be any antibiotic should be continued for at least 48 hours, and only if the culture is positive or the patient is worsening, only then will you change the antibiotic.
Okay. So, and sir, we add, can you just tell again, when do we add the antifungal?
So antifungal is added day 5. So first day 3 to 5, you give patients only antibiotics. If your patient is not improving on antibiotics on day 3 to 5 and your culture is negative, then you would add an antifungal agent. So day 1, no antifungal agent. Day 5, if patient has fever or hypotension and your culture is negative, you would add antifungal.
At what dose?
So that depends on
Okay,
which antifungal are you using. So if you're using echinocandin like capsofungin, then that is a 70 milligram loading dose, then 50 milligram dose. If you're using fluconazole, that's 200 milligram. So it depends on what antifungal you're using. So standard doses.
Okay, sir. So if there are any other questions, please you can unmute and ask. Okay, so sir, there are no more questions. So
Okay.
I'm really thankful that you spent your precious time.
Thank you.
And looking forward to your next class, sir.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.
Bye, bye, bye. Bye, all of you.